I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, who's had many friends and admirers at NYU for many years. She is Maria Sidorkina, who is coming up to us from UT Austin, where she's been teaching for the last 3 years in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. We don't, of course, always refer back to every degree that someone got, but I was very impressed when I went back to think about Maria's life and work that she got her undergraduate degree in both math and conflict at Stanford many years ago, which speaks well to range and precision. She got her PhD from Yale University in social anthropology just a few years ago. She was a postdoctoral fellow at Amherst and at Harvard until she had at least 1 year of doing proper teaching before the world turned a bit upside down, and it was, of course, stayed quite upside down. It's in these painful times that I think all of us are wondering what to make of the larger former Soviet and Russian world. And of course, as followers of the Jordan Center will know, there's been a lot of discussion among us about how best to respond to that. Some people for sure are unsure, some people are themselves unsure about whether we should be holding events at all. And I think I speak for most of my colleagues that we've all agreed that this couldn't be a more important time. And I would even go gladly a bit further and say that I think today's talk is a really important reminder of what's at stake in the many Russian worlds. Maria is someone who already gained a handful of followers, myself included, back in 2015 when she produced a terrific article in the Journal of Imperio on the making of different kinds of Russian publics and conversations around the question of protest. It was a terrific piece for anyone who has not seen it, a wonderfully finely tuned attention to language, and something that, of course, has gone on to inform so much of the research that she has been doing since. So timely or not, it's not her responsibility to answer for everything going on today, but my experience in reading her work and spending time with it again is that I think you'll find that it will do some of that. The title of our talk for today is Polarization and its Contents or Discontents, Russian activists search for points of contact in the late Putin era. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Maria Sidorkina.
Thank you for that lyrical introduction. Bruce, thank you so much for inviting me to the Jordan Center. Jordan Center folks, thank you, Sasha, for being, who's the organizer of these events here, for being the perfect herder of academics. You have just the right touch to remind just enough times to come just early enough. So I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be on the other side of the screen. As I was telling them, I'm a big fan of Jordan Center events. So I'm often on your side of the screen, digital audience. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it at this time. And I guess I will quickly just say a couple of words also to follow Bruce. You know, this talk was proposed a long time ago, and the abstract and title for it written, and right long before anyone could even imagine that the events and the horrible tragedy going on in Ukraine was even possible. And it feels really decadent to talk about anything but what's going on in Ukraine today. The destruction of Ukrainian lives and society is very devastating and depressing. We're really lucky here to be in this relatively richer, more secure place. And I think it's up to us, I think, to some extent. We who have the luxury of a space and time to talk, to help maybe generate some hope, some sense of solidarity for the future, maybe to talk about the resources we still have to fight against cruelty in all its forms across the different national boundaries. And so this talk, in a way, is actually, we're kind of going to travel back to a happier time. basically, I'll cover the period approximately for the sort of after Putin's after Putin became president for the third time in 2012. About 2011 to 2015 is the time. And this time was still really seemed a lot of full of possibilities for activists in Russia who I study. And I think the seeds of the present tragedy were visible then. And you will see kind of references to Ukraine in the quotes I used throughout the talk by some of the activists I worked with. But there was still a lot of hope. And I think that at that time, there was still time to uproot toxic forms of nationalism and imperialism. And so we'll see. I don't know. I hope maybe we can, just time travel. Okay, so my talk today is going to be about basically mainly two things. One is Russian public culture. This is what I work on. This is what I study. Back when I started my dissertation fieldwork like a decade ago, there were a lot of doubts that Russian public culture even existed or that it was worth talking about. And I think it is, and it definitely does exist. And I think we need to help preserve its history of experiments and kind of positive experiments. And I think it's really important for us, for scholars, to preserve this know-how of generations of activists who sort of develop this sort of experiences and skills of bringing people together as a people in Russia in distinction from a state. Kind of the resources for self-organization. And this public culture at times seems to be really fragile and precarious, but I think there's a lot of has a lot of resources, a lot of genres of public address that, and also traditions of critique and other resources for kind of addressing fellow Russians across cultural, class, and national divisions. And basically, that's what I'm going to be talking about. But I'm going to be talking about this time that's a little bit earlier in the wake of the fair elections protest movement. This is a time of kind of experimentation. Misha Gabovich, who's a scholar, wrote a book about protest in Russia, calls this a time of sociological reflexivity. There's basically this kind of wave of social effervescence where a lot of people were sort of thrown into politics and political activism and civic activism for the first time. And they were sort of trying to understand who they were and how to address fellow citizens. It was a really interesting time that it kind of ended around, I'd say, 2015, 16, 17, when the Navalny organization and there's a big push for Russians to kind of activists to enter electoral politics and kind of organization around that, and then kind of change the dynamics a bit, but we can talk about that later. And of course, another thing that rarely screwed over political activists that I worked with was the events in Crimea and the takeover of Crimea by Russia in 2014. This sort of was a time when Moscow's agenda kind of took over and unfortunately broke up a lot of the coalitions that were arising locally in various places in Russia. So other than Russian public culture, I'll be talking about this kind of network of activists in a city, the third largest city in Russia, called Novosibirsk. I was there for a year of field work in 2012, 2013, and then various summers before then and after then until 2018. And I studied how they attempted to basically self-organize. Novosibirsk, that's a little dot on the map there. It is territorially the largest city because it's in Siberia. It's the third largest by population. It's kind of interesting. It doesn't have a resource extraction economy like some other Siberian cities. So there's not like one boss or in the city who determines all the other political kind of alignments. The elites are more kind of labile. They're kind of shift around. Different levels of administration, the city, the region, the sort of little neighborhoods might compete against each other. And so that kind of also inspires, activists sometimes try to pit them against one another. So there's also, so that the line, there's not really a clear necessarily pro-regime, anti-regime kind of power in Novosibirsk, even still. Opposition officials have been elected. Last time was in 2015 when a red mayor became sort of, was supported by an opposition coalition to sort of become the mayor. Unfortunately, after that, after Crimea, KPRF, or the Russian Communist Party, kind of swung towards being very pro-regime. But that was an effort that really succeeded in Novosibirsk of uniting various political factions. And there's just a recent article about a recent coalition success around kind of smart voting strategies, Navalny's recent sort of push to unite activists that are anti-regime and run for office. So that's just something about Novosibirsk for you. And yeah, so the stuff I'm going to be talking today is based on participant observation, interviews, also media, sort of artifact collection, recording of events and transcribing events. So the thing that I'm going to start with is by talking about this sort of generally, the sort of idea of polarization and sort of how do people think about it today in for example, our scholarly communities. Why is it interesting? And I'm going to connect this conversation of how scholars talk about polarization today with the way the activists in this city in Novosibirsk sort of thought about, imagined, and resisted polarization. I kind of want to connect these two groups of interlocutors, I guess, in this talk. Part of the sort of, there's also a long tradition of scholars, I guess long, writing about polarization in Russia itself, and it just is just, there's some different, people used to talk about polarization differently. This is a new term that kind of came in since, I guess, in the last like 5 years. Before, people used different labels to talk about the same thing in the US and in Russia. So in Russia, you can see it from 2010 to on, there's this idea of the two Russias as kind of this imaginary of a fractured or divided kind of public or body politic. People also used the term culture war at the time, sort of that began, a lot of people dated to 2011, 2012, the fair elections protest movement and the regime's reaction to it, right? Where 2011, 2012, a lot of people of different kind of stripes and walks of life seemed to have a united front in some ways. And this culture war was supposed to break that up. It was basically an agenda driven by the regime, which a lot of Russian scholars kind of identified as being kind of a top-down polarization effect. But this is how they talked about it. I think it's nice in that, culture war and polarization are not the same thing. But in Russia, interestingly, right, Jan Kalinin has this great paper where he talks about how, in fact, this cultural gulf or cultural divides and differences became aligned with political differences. And today, a lot of people who write about Russian public life have actually tended to use the term polarization to write about the similar kinds of public phenomena. So this cultural gulf is used to interpret a political alignment of regime and anti-regime forces, and anti-regime forces are usually erased to mean just the liberals in the public sphere. So I just want to say that recently in Russia, I'm sorry for those who don't read Russian. I'm just going to point to things. A lot of this stuff here, you don't have to understand. I'm just going to say that this is some people recently using terms for like polarization in the last couple of years to talk about what they've been recently observing about Russian society. So for terms like disunity, polarization, and division of society. So this is still a topic that's on people's minds a lot in Russia, and I want to just, I guess, state that there's lots of continuity from after 2011 to today. So people, right, so and why are people still talking about, why are they still worrying about polarization? Well, people are worried that, kind of like we are when we talk about polarization, right? Speech might lead to confrontation, right? Violent speech, fuel aggression. that with people, right, hate, there's too much hate on their news feeds, that maybe this will lead to things like civil war or altercations, right? Maybe it'll turn people off from wanting to talk about politics. That polarization leads people to give attention only to those issues that cause just fights and flaming, right? Or like status seeking, right? Scoring points against one another. This is how we talk. Clever insults, right? Get all the attention as opposed to other things that might be worthy of our attention. So other things that might be worthy of our attention are things like poverty, lawlessness, corruption, or repressions, as here one of the activists, Kirill Medvedev, in the last slide says, right? Those are things we actually maybe should be talking about. And the other thing that people worry about, right, is that maybe we shouldn't talk about these sort of deep-seated, incommensurable kind of values, things that are so thickly connected to our identities that are sort of irresolvable. Well, we'll never be able to agree on them, right? Sort of philosophical questions, for example, or other topics that cause deep divides. Stalin, fascism, the USSR, other kind of conspiracy theory type narratives, right? Is Soros paying people to organize color revolutions? Like, that's not a good, right, topic to talk about, stuff like that. Polarization also really feels a certain way to people. People kind of talk about the negative feelings associated with them. So I'll talk here today about polarization, but I want to say that at the end of my talk, hopefully most of the focus will be on kind of what some people call in the scholarly community depolarization, and how people sort of depolarization doesn't feel as sort of, people don't feel as strongly when they engage in it as they do when they engage in polarizing talk. But depolarization is a little bit different. It doesn't have quite as many feelings attached to it. Something else is at work. So again, the activists I work with try to resist this polarization agenda that they feel comes from Moscow, despite the fact that they themselves have a lot of fundamental disagreements and incommensurate obligations to their communities. So this is, do you have a clock in this room, or? No. Okay, so have it on me. I can't see it. I'm sorry, I'm just going to grab my phone to time myself. And I'll spend like 45 minutes on the introduction. Okay, great. So this is just to give you like a quick outline, in case you're not like super, in the polarization literature like I am, just like why people think about it and worry about it, or how they try to justify their worries. This is, I think, political science kind of take on it. And basically it's that when our attachments to our identities, right, are really strong. And so when we become attached to political identity in the same way, like partisan identity, that kind of supersedes our attachments to, for example, things like, right, weaker allegiance to democratic principles, right? It relatively becomes more important to us. These political attachments that are sort of part of our identity become more important to us than these sort of, right, theories about how democracy should work. So this is right for would-be authoritarians. If they get people to sort of be invested in politics as a part of their identity, then they can kind of get away with more stuff. People will sort of let a lot of things slide because they're less kind of invested in democracy as not a part of their identity, sort of vague, abstract democracy, right? So, and then just, this is, polarization, like concerns are not only in the US, I'm sure you all know about this stuff, but for example, Andrew Grant wrote about polarization in Macedonia, which is played out in North Macedonia now, I guess, sorry, North. How it's played out sort of very similarly to the way it's played out in Russia. And he talks about, this is sort of a consensus that it's the identitarianization of political persuasion. That's kind of what polarization is, right? And it has emerged as a global phenomenon. He cites a scholar who writes about the same kind of thing going on, for example, in India. Chris Bale, this is a guy from communications, I think. He has a lab, the polarization lab at Duke. And he also has a similar kind of, working theory that, well, actually, I just wanted to note that there's a lot of kind of talk about polarization increasing in recent years, since like, you know, maybe the Trump election or whatever. But most of the research, I think, has shown that actually it's really hard to argue that polarization actually has increased at all. And there's always been worries about echo chambers and social media fueling kind of these bubbles and echo chambers. And there's actually like almost no empirical research showing that these also exist. Maybe like 5% of the population online may be in echo chambers, but actually they're a lot less. There's fewer divides online than there is sort of in traditional media consumption. So most of the polarization, and this is Chris Bale talks about it as being kind of an perceptions of polarization as increasing. So the number of times media elites use the term polarization has skyrocketed, and people talk about it just way more. And actually that in itself has effects, because it turns people sort of off from what they think is right, sort of these sort of unsavory interactions. So whether polarization is increased at all, probably not. In fact, you know, if you do even surveys of sort of how people think about different like items, like people are sort of slowly kind of more or less in the US, for example, thinking more along the same lines about things, but perceptions have really skyrocketed. I just want to say other people writing about polarization other than this is anthropologists, communication scholars, and performance studies people. So here's Chris Grobe, who also writes about polarization in this particular way, right? How polarization feels. And it has something to do with, right, kind of embodied kind of, right, dispositions of finding someone ridiculous or threatening, things like that. So this is my my stock image. Forgive the stock image picture here. But sort of why is this so compelling? This polarization imaginary. Why, even though there's a lot of studies showing that polarization hasn't actually increased, do we keep talking about it? Why are we so worried about it? And I just, you know, the basically, I just want to say that it's not necessarily. The literature, you can actually kind of trace and say that the worries about polarization are very similar to earlier worries about like maybe a decade ago about civility in politics. And then we can go back all the way to like early modern Europe when people were worried about toleration and civility too after the religious wars. And the kinds of worries they have are actually very much about the same thing. And most of these concerns can be boiled down to the sort of fear that the liberal kind of public, right, this public sphere conversation is somehow being challenged or destroyed in similar ways. So I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I'd like to talk about the polarization not as a thing, right? Not as a thing that's increasing, not as a thing that we can actually measure through opinion polls, but as an imaginary, right? Something that has social force and social life, despite not being necessarily, right, sort of something we can prove through like statistical opinion polls. And this is kind of my map of what are the components of this polarization imaginary. Well, I'm going to talk today about signs of polarization, polarization experts, performances of polarization, and rituals of depolarization. And I think for me, sort of, I think those are the main components of this imaginary that I'd like to talk about. And just how I'm using the term imaginary here. Imaginary is, you know, kind of a term that I think originally Charles Taylor, right, from Modern Social Imaginaries, kind of borrowed from Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, and we all know how those work, so it's not that much of a stretch. It kind of, it's not just, right, imagined things, it's kind of how do we do life in terms of combining ideas and practice, right? As Charles Taylor called it, it's what goes with what things come together, how are they paired? And those are, right, some of the imaginaries that kind of operate in our world today. Just a list, right? Sort of Habermas, right, with the public sphere, but if you actually translated something like publicness, right, publiczność, right, all of these are kinds of imaginaries. Anthropologists have written about this. Anthropologists of like public life have written about this as in other ways, regimes of circulation, cultures of circulation, ideologies of circulation. Right, all of these things, bubbles, echo chambers, the people, scholarly community, the movement, all of these things are imaginaries. And of course, Michael Warner has also, I think, made a lasting impact in the way he's talked about publics in our neck of the woods in anthropology, how to think about public life. So in public speech, canonically, I just wanted to, instead of listing a bunch of things, this is kind of how we imagine. This is from Saussure, Talking Heads. It's a little diagram of the speech circuit that he drew in the early 20th century, but it's kind of, I think it's a nice diagram of how we imagine public sphere interaction to take place. Basically, right, I mean, anthropologists like Michael Lemper wrote about is that for Habermas, he actually, for example, as one of the Habermas is sort of right, a political philosopher, I think best articulated the common sense of what it means to live in a liberal public. What was really important is this idea of egalitarian reciprocity, that taking turns at talk, and the kinds of talk that happened in like 18th century salons in France and Germany and England, the kind of talk that allowed people to sort of focus on the content of conversations and not on their dependence on patrons, right? Or on their kind of external to the conversation connections and identities. Habermas sort of identified that people were really invested in saying that they're independent from economic obligations, for example, or political obligations. This kind of independence, this bracketing of obligations, this bracketing of sort of your body even, right? Didn't matter who you were, was really important. Was one of the effects of the kinds of conversations Habermas thought was really relevant and key to liberal publicity. Other attributes of public and the liberal imaginary is that participation in public speech typically involves address to potential strangers. And a consciousness of a participation in a broader public. So you might be sitting in the salon and exchanging kind of, taking turns at talking to other people, but you feel like you're a part, your specific circle of persons is something more, right? Part of the public through this act of imagination. And that's why the public is an imaginary. This sort of diagramming of equality and egalitarian kind of symmetry by people kind of, right, taking turns, Habermas thought would actually guarantee a kind of critical rationality. This sort of very act of bracketing other concerns that you might have for the sake of the current conversation and coming to intersubjective agreement. And this imaginary, I mean, Habermas' sort of summary of public sphere kind of interaction has been very criticized internally. We have never been really public in the same way that we have never been modern. But this, the public, Michael Warner writes wonderfully about this, right, has always coexisted with realities of limits, its limits to access for, right, and it has always excluded people on the basis of things like literacy, right, on sort of poverty or property, manners, or actually access to technology. There's always been limits, but except at key sites, right? At key sites where these conversations could take place in a certain way, that then we enable people to project this idea of the public imaginary. So the reason people are so worried about things like bubbles and echo chambers is because address, which is meant to be kind of indefinite and potentially include anyone in public conversations, bubbles mean that actually this address is limited. It can't address anyone. And there's these social limitations in access to this space of joint attention, and those are a real problem for liberal political theory. Right? We're sort of always concerned, sort of civility and incivility, bubbles and polarization threaten this model of liberal publicity that actually we're always engaged in less than public spheres, only among people like us. And those are the threats. So I just want to say, so the way I'm going to be talking about is, and James Slaughter has a great article, so a fellow linguistic anthropologist said the way we imagine, like, what is our place in, right, the public, or a huge imaginary like that, the way we imagine it is by actually, there are certain signs of circulation. There's certain things that help us kind of visualize and picture ourselves. And kind of get a picture of how discourse circulates and our place in this world in which it circulates, a sort of larger scale thing, right? We kind of operate, so things like for, Benedict Anderson, it was like newspapers and novels, for example, right? If you see someone on the train next to you reading a newspaper, you can kind of see the newspaper as a sign of the circulation of the thing you're reading, and you kind of see yourself as a part of, for example, society of, America or something like that at the time. Right, and we kind of consume media, whether I read the New York Times or whatever, it's a sign, kind of, it's a ritual of consumption that kind of always locates us in this imaginary of, with respect to larger social realities. Signs of circulation kind of point, in a way, often point to the speech chains to which they've come to us. They kind of point to the limits of their circulation as well. So for example, if, let's talk about bubbles and echo chambers that we've had, for a while. In order to know that you're in a bubble, you kind of have to know where the limits are, right, of your bubble. You have to see where that edge is, which you don't normally see. So what happens, what is special about polarization and bubbles that makes us feel kind of delimited in a certain way? I just want to say that one thing that in Russia really feels this is these mutual insults that pro-regime and anti-regime publics used to characterize one another. So you might compare this to, I don't know if you guys remember the sort of liberal crybabies or snowflakes that, Trump supporters would use to talk about liberals in the US, libs, or, right, this term deplorables, for example, right, that Clinton used to describe Trump supporters. So this is similar. So these are the terms here that liberals, quote unquote, used to describe pro-regime supporters. And these are terms that regime supporters used to describe the liberal opposition typically. Some of you who study contemporary Russia might recognize a lot of them. There's so many. Actually, I found way more on this side, but I'm sure there's really good ones on the other side as well. So these kinds of insults, these things kind of work as signs of circulation, because when you insult somebody, you're basically, right, drawing a picture of who, right, you're addressing, but actually who you're talking to, but who you're not addressing as an equal, right? An insult has a particular kind of sort of what Bakhtin called addressivity. It's meant to, right, land to someone not as if they're an equal participant in a conversation, but as if sort of degraded, right? You call people names, kind of, in this particular, it models a particular kind of interaction. A lot of these, they're actually kind of sociologically particular. They're kind of identified, sort of the insults the liberals lobby at, the regime supporters are often kind of, right, like things like trash. They're kind of classed, right, kind of blue collar class. And often if you read in comments, people will say something like, oh, these people, like, this just because they don't make enough money, et cetera. And there's lots of research on this if you're interested. They're less cultured, they're kind of poorly paid, they don't travel, et cetera. There's kind of different connotations with sort of the liberals there. So I think these are really interesting as signs of sort of, right, delimiting the publics, right? If we're calling certain people bigots, then we're not going to address them, right, on equal terms, because we can't, they're bigots. Or if we call them sort of somehow degraded reptiloids, we are no longer in this kind of, right, symmetrical interaction with them that the liberal publicity presupposes. So, and this is a nice example of kind of how discourse, speech signs, so those are things people talk about, is characterized in this meme as sort of people belonging to really poor houses like this, really crappy houses. This is the kind of stuff they talk about, right? So sort of the sociological particularity goes with like the kind of talk, right, that sort of happens in their bubble. So signs of circulation are often also signs of belonging, right? Who do we address? Who we consider inside or outside our bubble? So I just want to say the thing that I'm interested in mostly is actually not necessarily these insults, but how, and I'm sorry for those of you who don't speak Russian, I'm just going to point to things, because actually what I want you to see is the quotation marks themselves rather than the meaning. So that often these insults will be used by people kind of to say, hey, you liberal have called me a bigot, right? Kind of will be used by pro-regime, for example, publics. So here's a Russian Orthodox activist at a protest who's saying, who's quoting a liberal, and the liberal is calling the Russian Orthodox bydla or trash. So as you can see, right, this immediately kind of draws out the picture, say, those people over there call us trash, they've kicked us out of their, right, public in a sense. And so I'm not going to translate this one, but basically all of these quotation marks that you see are what people who are pro-regime, typical things pro-regime people say, right? And so this is, these signs of circulation are these sort of citations, right, that other people say that sort of delimit the picture. So instead of kind of reciprocity and symmetry, we have something more like this, where anti-regime media bubble says, I think, right, so yeah, do you see, so we have this like bubbles going on. This is kind of what polarization is, right? The anti-regime media bubble calls pro-regime people bigots, and the pro-regime media bubble calls anti-regime people liberosity. So they're mutual characterizations, right, that are sort of used to draw the limits of circulation. So now I'm just going to switch to talking about this particular case of polarization in Novosibirsk, what people characterized sort of drama of polarization that unfolded there between 2012 mainly and 2015, although it had precursors and after effects. And it has to do with kind of this activist network, which is, is fairly, I guess, they measure their own size, depending on the impact they have, but probably like 100 activists of different stripes that were interacting regularly throughout this event, this kind of media event or media process. But their public was much larger, and the way that they measured their public was by saying, hey, how many, we staged this protest and 50,000 people read, for example, an article about this protest. So their public was larger and also influential to the point where they could influence local election results. So I'm going to talk about this kind of event of this drama of polarization. The original event took place, so I'm just going to quickly just give you a brief outline of the events. There's Pussy Riot happened in 2012, and these liberal activists wanted to protest in support of the participants. They requested permission, and the state refused to let them do it because they wanted to exclude the possibility of conflict. They wanted to protect, supposedly, the liberal activists from attack, from aggression by the Orthodox. Some other events, but the protest is allowed for in defense of values, right? Of Orthodox activists, who in this example are pro-regime. They actually had to protest on the same date and time in the same place that the liberal activists were supposed to protest. And I just want to say all of this is taking place, and in the background, there's kind of new law restricting public assembly going on. And this protest here is the one I'm going to focus on, the original event that caused kind of hostilities to erupt and basically precipitated this long morality battle on the streets of Novosibirsk. Some things that happened afterwards are counter-protests by the liberals who mock the Orthodox activists. There's a mock protest. And then there's also Orthodox activist protests Sasha Gray's, you guys probably know her, as very immoral. Then, just to say, in the background of this, there is this election of the Red Mayor in Novosibirsk. Then here's some other things that happen as a result of the original altercation. Orthodox activists boycott a Behemoth concert, and actually, they don't let it happen. They cancel it. They stand there and they block people from entering. Then the opposition organizes a response protest. Then there's an orthodox kind of protest in defense of morality and against Marilyn Manson, because he was supposed to have a concert, or she. And then there's finally the culmination of all of this protest, counter-protest dialogue, is this humongous freedom of expression protest that really brought the city together against, I guess, these Orthodox activists. Some of you might have heard of it. It was there was a supposedly blasphemy in this Wagner production, and it led to the removal of the opera director. And there's this huge kind of rallying around Moscow, stay out of Novosibirsk, kind of with your meddling. So just really quickly, we have like 10 minutes, something like that. Yeah. Okay. So, really quickly, I'm just gonna wave my hands here and give you guys give you all the shape of an argument. So this is the April 7th altercation. This is what happened. This is how people talked about it. Do you see the quotation marks again? So everyone has kind of characteristic kind of thing that they're called by the other side, bigots versus molesters. So this is an article covering the day that the liberal activists wanted to protest in support of Pussy Riot and the state didn't allow them, they showed up to the site of protest and found these Orthodox activists. And basically, if you can see this, right, this guy's kind of lunging at an activist, Artyom Moskotov. So this is the picture, right, of opposition, kind of people standing face to face, but opposing, ready to fight. There was swearing, there was some torn signs and danger. So some activists got egged by the Orthodox. People said, you better leave and go back to university campus before things get really bad. There was aggression. There were comments on social media threatening activists or saying we should do something about these liberals, right? And this is right. This is how it's sort of described as a site of confrontation. In Russian, противостояние, right, where you face each other, but there is no talk, right? You clash. It's sort of the diagram of this event. I just want to, again, this is how one activist described it. I'm not going to translate it, but again, do you see all of these quotes are, again, titles, right? They're sort of characterizations of how the liberals and the bigots and the libtards see each other. And so this is just another example from, again, opposition or confrontation. These are the Orthodox activists blocking entrance to the Behemoth concert. So you can see they're like really fit, I guess, and strong dudes. Maybe potential thing. And here's just the Marilyn Manson fans at they showed up at a morality protest, also kind of standing there in confrontation, right, in opposition, kind of holding ranks. And so everyone has their kind of troops. So this is important. So this event is kind of this dramatization of how polarization is, like on the street, right? They're actually acting out the script of what happens when people oppose each other. They swear, right? They tear each other's signs. There's kind of violence of confrontation. So another thing that's really important to the polarization imaginary is then step in all the polarization experts who are really important for managing polarization. If there's polarization, call them in. Right, this is the question of kind of that I had as the subtitle. This is from a slogan from the free speech protest in 2015. Who benefits, right, from this kind of drama of polarization playing out in our city? And this is who benefits, right? One, state officials and the police. So I have a great quote from a state official who's like, when these events happen, you have to be above the fray. You can't be there, right? Like you can't feed one side and another. There needs to be someone who's above the fray. and who's above the fray is the state. So it kind of legitimates state intervention. And also the police, right? So immediately there's worries. Why couldn't the police protect the liberal activists from aggression? We need more police. So this is a great, you can't see it, but this is when the original liberal activists were denied permission to protest for the sake of their security, right? The justification was that we want to protect you from the Orthodox. So the state is necessary. This is just, sorry. Oh yeah, so here's right, Russia Today, the state media outlet, kind of saying, hey, like we know to talk about, polarization. Russia has a divided society. We're really worried. This is interesting, right? It kind of empowers them. You say Putin also talks about this stuff, but so other polarization experts are media journalists and scholars. I'm not going to read this because I'm out of time, but basically they collect data on who says what. They collect information on polarization. I have a great interview with a journalist who says, well, there was like Sasha Grey was coming to visit in Novosibirsk and no one knew about it. So we called the Orthodox activists and we're like, did you know Sasha Grey is coming? And they're like, we didn't know. And then they issued a statement and that they published the statement and it became an event. So the guy actually says, we created this event. We created this scandal. And he says, who benefits? Journalists, right? So clearly that's something. Another party that benefits is also activists who get kind of, right, some civil or social capital from dramatizing polarization. So here's an example of the liberal activists mocking or dressing up as trash, or kind of Russian version of white trash, misspelling signs. They're sitting, you can't see that, they're squatting and spitting sunflower seeds and drinking beer in a public place, kind of acting out bidla to make fun of them. So they're also, and this is, as you see, 50,000 readers. This is really big for Novosibirsk. So they're kind of also benefiting here from polarization. But then, right, there's also costs. There's huge cost to polarization for the activists. One is that they can't, right, first of all, sometimes you need, more police will show up. Then sometimes Moscow will intervene with a show force or bring in siloviki or the force ministries, right, to control what happens. And that happened in 2015 after Crimea, this yearly festival of demonstration that happens, every year uninterrupted. It was banned from taking place because Moscow sort of federal power industries came and prevented this tradition from happening. There's activists talk about all the other costs that they suffer. And so what they do to kind of diffuse, right, they sort of self-organized basically to diffuse this sort of standoff. Through organizing sort of numerous, there's numerous kinds of things, but one thing that was really popular at the time was discussions. And they're not the kind of discussions that are like round tables where everyone has a role that some was organized by one political party or another. Activists really treasured these kind of self-organized discussions. So one of the discussion, as a result of the kind of mock protest that I showed you, where they were mocking, right, the Orthodox activists, as a result of this, this provoked them to exchange numbers and to decide to come together. And they came together and they basically tried to talk about stuff. And this was in the refectory of the church, a local church. So these are Orthodox activists, liberals, and some other activists as well from different political affiliations. And they had tea. You can see there's jam. It's very humble, right? This is not the kind of like media spectacle political discussion that you see in Moscow, or like the coalition, or like opposition coalition after 2011. They had very low kind of standards for what to accomplish. And it's interesting because these discussions, like if you I guess here's a good sorry, I'll show you that, but basically they didn't like become these sort of places of resolving anything. Like no one really could bridge the incremental divide that people had, right? If you're atheist or if you're a believer, a priest says, right, like I love the church like I love my mother. If someone offends my church, how can I not, right, react to the sort of the Pussy Riot thing, right? There was really no kind of debate. There wasn't any, substantive agreement or anything, but what they did achieve, and I'm just gonna point to the quotation marks again. So here's the priest, a deacon talking, you guys thought, I thought you were all, this is a derogatory term for gay to describe the liberals because they're pro-LGBT. And he says, and you thought we were all bidla, or we were all, right, trash. So he's using these words actually in the discussion itself to then, right, to address these activists. He's sort of saying, hey, I know about these, right, two separate kind of regimes of circulation, and these terms demarcate them. And I'm gonna actually say, well, but actually we're like beyond that, right? They sort of act out sort of a little connection between, let's see. Oh yeah, here's a great kind of another quote where he says, this is a liberal activist this time saying, well, we had a discussion. And he was really dismissive about the discussion accomplishing anything substantive. He said, but now we have each other's phone numbers, so we can call each other to avoid conflict, right? Perhaps the point of the discussion was that we didn't know one another personally before, and now we do. Right? We can sit down and talk and hold peaceful protests in the city. And so a lot of people assess the outcomes of this discussion as sort of, well, now, like, basically we have each other's phone numbers, we can call each other. And for example, the liberals, we're going to have a protest, and they moved their protest a little further away from the church, and thus it was less provocative to the Orthodox. And the Orthodox didn't, quote unquote, show up with bats to the liberal protest, right? So it was a kind of a de-escalation. And then, right, so it might be interesting that some of the stereotypes people have about the Orthodox, they were contested. So another bit is the discussion was covered in the media, right? So that's important. There's lots of cameras. The Orthodox actors behaved in a very self-possessed, cultured manner, right? They showed that they were cultured people. I think this was the other point of the discussions. So not exactly, finding consensus or anything like that, really low stakes. And this is another communist activist that talks about another discussion they had about Putin and between the Putin opposition, and say, well, we can't really achieve, right, consensus in 2 hours. It was really maybe impossible because as we found points of contact between opposing sides. And he says, well, for example, I met a United Russia elected official in the Duma, in the local kind of representative, who was okay. He seemed normal. He wasn't insane. So I just, basically, I think the nice thing about these like discussions, tea drinkings, that people have really low expectations. They don't expect, right? And sometimes they do, and sometimes they actually act out polarization. And the discussions are they can be very much full of insults and full of incommensurable kind of identities. But they do say, hey, but we can talk again later. Or they say, hey, but we got each other's phone numbers. And so we don't get this, and we don't get this, but we get this, right? It's sort of a diagram, a new kind of diagram, right? Where things now circulate between these opposing, right, people. Whether it's, whatever circulates might be really minimal, right? Minimal kind of face wants were fulfilled, right? Minimal respect offered. Oftentimes people actually would insult each other right then, and discussions would be interrupted or disrupted, but that doesn't matter because the sort of shared footing was achieved. I just want to say, so my final thing is, I'm going to just skip to the end. So the way that these activists, and you can, they have so many quotes and wonderful remarks, the way that they approach these kind of little rituals of reciprocity or depolarization is actually really similar to the way some kind of pragmatist scholars think about what is civil discussion for. For example, Teresa Behan has a great book called Mere Civility about how Roger Williams in early kind of modern sort of in America, in Rhode Island, right? He said, right, it's okay if we don't actually like each other, we can hate each other, but we have to be sort of merely, like there has to be just enough civility to keep the conversation going, a really minimal amount. Then we can let, anti-Christian Catholics or heathens be part of this sort of shared space of connection and co-presence. And Rorty also writes about this, right, this idea of contingency, how you don't have to have a critical rational debate to produce an outcome that's favorable or pro-democratic. It's enough to just act out some reciprocity. You can use any resources you have available at hand, whether it be tea and jam, or whether it is something, right, like turn taking around a table, or whether it's, some of the actors like holding hands or something like that. So any resources go. It doesn't have to be some sort of really robust, right, kind of symmetry and egalitarianism that you get out of it. So that's it. That's my little outline of how we're going to take this paper. It's maybe pretty sketchy, but I got to draw some arrows. So
we'll start. So Sasha, please.
This was really excellent. Thanks for sharing this. So my research is on somewhat similar kinds of protests in Moscow, and I had a couple of questions actually. So I was wondering I trust that I'm a political scientist, so some of the framework that you're using is kind of unfamiliar to me, but I was wondering if you could comment on to what extent the different polls are using similar tactics, or to what extent this is symmetrical across both the polls? Because at the beginning you made a comment about polarization, that it's a great pretext for authoritarianism because the sort of increase in ideological thinking among people kind of lets them, they want more state intervention, et cetera. But that seems like it's largely true in the setting that you're looking at for the Orthodox activists, whereas the liberal activists are usually, the examples you gave here, they're protesting about freedom of expression, civil liberties, constitutionally guaranteed rights, allegedly, whereas the Orthodox are not, and also obviously are much more closely aligned with the regime's ideological agenda. And then also, you pointed out at the picture of one of the concerts that was being boycotted, that like these Orthodox activists are so like young and fit. Are those actually Orthodox activists? Because my experience, the Orthodox community is also very, very likely to like hire thugs or like motorcycle gangs, and also there are organizations of people who just, they're like neo-fascists who just want to beat up liberals, who go around to support Orthodox causes. This happens at least in Moscow, just because they love fighting and they want to get involved in that. So I'm kind of wondering, I guess, on the Orthodox side, like what types of actors are participating in this? Because it seems like if you're just a neo-fascist who wants to beat up some of the liberals, you're not going to attend one of these meetings over tea. And also the people attending the meetings over tea, whatever happens there is not really going to affect you or affect that sort of bigger ecosystem, I guess.
Well, this is okay. Well, okay. One thing is like, who are those pumped activists? So there were Orthodox bodybuilders. So one of them actually did attend this discussion, and he had a comment. I can give you the quote, and he's like, "Well, like next time, like he promised not to bring his bat to the showdown, right?" So there's a sort of Orthodox bodybuilders, but there was this sort of conspiracy theories among the liberal activists, like did they hire a bunch of thugs? And it was never really like disputed, but I think basically this bodybuilder guy probably had friends or something. So I wouldn't be like totally like hermeneutic of suspicion, like this is all cynical use of these thugs. I think they actually had strong alignments with the Orthodox communities, and one of them did come. So come to these events, and then the reason they came is because there was the media was there, and they wanted to get some attention. And the asymmetry, you know what, Sasha, this is a great question, because on the one hand we have this show of like muscle, and on the other hand the Marilyn Manson fans, right? There's sort of these like little kids, remember, like their arms crossed. But this is something that you should look at. For example, Ilya Kalinin, I'm not going to share the screen now, but right, there's like weapons of the weak can be really powerful, like the sort of mock protest where they like acted out the Orthodox as trash, people, right, and they had 50,000 views. It was a huge media sensation. There's way more media attention than any Orthodox protest ever got. And it was really cruel. I mean, there's a lot of great scholars who write about the cruelty of like liberal characterizations of Russian working class workers where, or sort of working class kind of pro-regime supporters, where it's also equally kind of, right, it's not physical violence, but it's very violent, right, kind of degradation. I think really like, right to the point where sort of culture, right, so you being uncultured is a really powerful weapon that can shut down voices. So it's not exactly symmetrical, but there's a lot of great research on the kind of the violence of liberal oppositional treatment of sort of the cattle that is really sort of, it has huge media resonances that really dominates public perceptions of non-liberal kind of opposition to the regime. Yeah.
We have lots of questions, but let's go back and forth. Next is Michelle Rivkinfish up on the screen. And then one here, we'll go back.
Hi, can you hear me? It's
yes.
Said, okay. So first of all, this was excellent, really exciting and important work. And I actually wanted to follow up on the comments you just made in response to the first question. I'm wondering how the liberals themselves respond to this critique that they are having an elitist class bias, that they're engaging in cruelty against, and whether some of them are embracing a neoliberal ideology that's basically saying, well, we work hard and they are lazy, or is there some kind of maybe a socialist awareness that there's a class elitism and bias here that's a problem? Thank you.
Great, Michelle, yes, and I quote, I use your research so often about class, I just taught it, I think, last semester about, right, the classism of Russian liberals. And this has always been true. And I think your question is, has there been any progress since that time, right? Has culturedness given way at all as a potent force for discriminating against kind of non-elite, right, participants in the political conversation? I think there's been some progress in the kind of the public sphere conversation. There's definitely like the socialists and the leftists are super attuned to it, and they're usually the vocal critics in the media, right? Like Kirill Medvedev, like Oleg Zhuravlyov, Ilya Matveyev, Ilya Budraitskis, who point out, right, how toxic and unhelpful, to say the least, the liberal kind of. But it's hard because I think, Michelle, you would know that it's really an embodied disposition, this kind of classism. And I have so many comments where people try, but they can't help being classist. So for example, Navalny is a great example of someone who really tries. I just want to show you guys this. I'm going to share the screen for 1 second, because this is a really great illustration of both what's changed and what has not. Do you see this? This is in Novosibirsk when Navalny visited in 2015, and this is a leftist activist from the AKM, which is sort of a communist but not KPRF, but this alternative leftist force. And they're having a conversation. And so Navalny was trying to say, hey, let's unite. Let's build solidarity, right? He's trying to reach the sort of large left contingent of Russia that are not liberal. And there's some great writing about this recently by left intellectuals in Russia, his effort to kind of change. But if you actually listen to his speech in Novosibirsk, it was super duper kind of like, we have to like have some civilized conversation. We can't like heckle anyway. It's hard. It's hard to bad habits, hard to beat them. So I don't know. I think the recent events show that these voices, the left voices, unfortunately, who are trying to do this work are kind of haven't gotten enough of a platform yet. So
next up is Rosa, and then we'll go back to the screen, and then another one.
Really thank you enormously both for the talk, but also especially for this last discussion on the classism. And I do think, sorry, maybe I should bracket it for another time. ask a simpler question. But you've done research in Moscow and Novosibirsk, and I'm just very curious, how do the confrontations, bubbles and dialogues between these opposing groups compare in these two states?
That's a really great question, Austin. And actually, this is kind of, the Novosibirsk activists I talked to are really proud that their kind of local political scene is not warped by celebrity politics, and that in Moscow, this is the case. So I don't know if you know, the opposition coalition after the fair elections protest movement that ended in basically 2012, there was these efforts to unite the opposition, but there would be these outsized personalities, and they would constantly fight over procedures. And the problem is, and because they wanted to really nail down like what was allowed, what was not allowed, they wanted to model the perfect like Habermasian ideal critical rational conversation, right? Censoring each other all the time, just obsessed, and this really like did not work. And the problem is, I think Teresa Behan, who's a political philosopher, writes about this, right? Procedure in itself is super cultural. You can't necessarily like agree on procedure if people are coming from very different places. You have to have a really minimal expectation for whether people are even going to agree to take turns or not. You have to be like okay with their occasionally erupting flame wars, right? Or people testifying, right? There's different genres of kind of exchanging, you know, taking turns, maybe preaching it should be okay. And I think the Novosibirsk activists feel kind of proud that they're, you know, they have less of the sort of celebrity ego. Their face wants, I think, are a little less intense than in Moscow, and they identify themselves and distinguish themselves from that in Moscow. And in Moscow, I mean, it's a different highly capitalized ballgame where they aim at national politics often. So that's the other thing, is that sometimes the national agenda doesn't just come from the Kremlin, it comes from, for example, Navalny. And that really disrupts local self-organization efforts, for good or for ill. It really organizes a certain network of activists and aligns them in a particular way, but then it leaves others way out. For example, the Navalny smart voting thing. I just want to say in Novosibirsk, though, they did successfully form a coalition this last time. There was a nationalist, a liberal, and a kind of like you know, neoliberal together in the coalition, and they won 3 seats in the local kind of government, and that was really, you know, I think there's an exception to the rule. So thank you. Renata?
Right. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, Maria. Yeah, it's great. It's great to see you, and thank you so much for for this wonderful talk. Yeah, so I have 2 questions, or more like comments, and you know, I would like to hear your thoughts about that. You know, and doubt together. You know, so I was once doing this interview also with a liberal journalist, and I was very impressed because she used a term of donor eater, so grantajor, referring to herself. So right, and my question was here that how can we think of this kind of appropriation of this potentially insulting vocabulary by these groups to refer to themselves?
Yeah.
And like, have you ever seen other examples? And I see that you are actively nodding, so you must be thinking of that. And if we have time, I have another like question, or more like a comment. So to your point about like performing in public this mutual desire of reaching some points of contact, and you mentioned the Council of Coordination of Opposition that was active in 2012. And I agree with you that it was just hilarious to see, you know, how they performed this kind of confrontation, the nationalists and the liberals. And I also thought about like other occasions of like this public demonstration of unlikely instances of dialogue and partnership. And for example, so there was this case when the Pussy Riot participant Maria Sidorkina got together with a Christian and anti-gay activist Dmitry Anteo, and how it was also discussed on social media and by different publics. And another case that I was thinking of, it was like this YouTube show, I think, between a pro-Kremlin activist Kristina Potupchik and opposition liberal activist Maria Baronova. And I was just like wondering, how should we think of this? What do we do of this, like in terms of like your framework of, you know, thinking about polarization, rituals of depolarization? Are these rituals, or it's, yeah, so, you know, just thinking aloud.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, yeah, great. Well, I just want to say, I didn't have time to talk about it, but this idea, so this use of the label. So there's this great, have this, it was the discussions where exactly what you're talking about was happening, where a liberal, for example, this liberal, Christian liberal, but very, right, progressive blogger says, "Я как либераст." Like she says, I as a libtard, right, have this to say. So I think, so this is funny because at the same time as these discussions, again, are also dramas of polarization at the same time as they depolarize. She's also right, she's saying I'm above this whole scene, right? It's kind of saying I'm an expert in polarization. It's basically a way of credentializing yourself as an expert in Russian social public discourse. And of course, even using these terms or quoting these terms, it really shows that you're party to the national conversation, right? You've been recruited, you have the credentials to participate. It's a way of credentializing yourself, saying, I know the lingo, I know the discourse of who is mrakavias, who is liberast. So in all those discussions, these terms, that these signs of circulation pop up all the time to kind of credentialize yourself. Activists use them, right, as saying, hey, like, I can map this whole thing for you. I know what the map is like, right? I know where you are, where we are, and we're trying to get above it all. So it's kind of a reflexivity, right? And you can align. So usually these tokens of circulation, they're not just sort of addressing people, they're also kind of, you can align to them differently, right? And this is how kind of Bakhtin writes about, right? Kind of, and Goffman too, about footing, right? How these tokens are important in terms of how we can then express alignment to them. But yeah, and I think what you're talking about, the other question around is yeah, those are great observations about where is there potential? Is there still any potential for these rituals of polarization now? Where can they take place if they sort of, and I think maybe in local elections in Moscow, probably there's some of that going on. Is that it?
We may have a question here. I couldn't remember.
No,
I have one otherwise. Do you want to answer her second question, Maria?
Well, I think your second question was about these kind of right in Moscow, whether these right, these moments where right, so these people who would otherwise be, as they call them, nierukopozhatne, or people who wouldn't shake each other's hand if they met in the street. This is a term used to describe kind of whether you're okay, as in, in the sphere of activism, are you like beyond the pale or not, basically, right? Do we have, I think you're asking like, are there, maybe not you can elaborate, but I think you're just saying that, are there rituals for acting out that certain people are no longer beyond the pale, like Alyoshina and this right-wing, or the sort of alt-right, I guess, activists being together. But I think that was a huge scandal for the Moscow public to see them together. So I don't know.
So my question was really just to ask you, how should we think of that, and how can we apply your framework to think through these cases, and also like the public debate around these cases, because they seem to like polarize even more, because yeah,
that's a great question, and yeah, and I think that the answer is like, you just have to kind of try anything, and if that doesn't work, you have to try something else. And I think this is what the willingness of the activists I work with, to experiment and like try the most basic things, like what if they're seen as enemies but they're like tea drinking together or something. Like, you got to be innovative, you have to use the resources, right, that Russia, for example, public already has. So for example, right, it might literally be like shaking hands in the street, or I don't know. I guess my answer is like, this is contingent. All of these, there's not like an ultimate, right, kind of foundation for how depolarization works. This is totally contingent and depending on context and your available rituals that you already have in your society for kind of diagramming, right, for drawing pictures of reciprocity. Anything can work, and I don't know, and I guess whether they're, I guess whether they sometimes might not work. And I think sometimes they will, and you just have to experiment. And I think that's okay. Be okay that sometimes actually makes things worse. But maybe as long as it establishes contacts, that's good enough. And for example, the protest that I talked about, the morality bro protest, where they were basically shaming these Orthodox activists, it was an act of intensification of polarization, but it was that intensity that actually had them call each other and organize the discussion. So sometimes playing out dramas of polarization can itself lead to attempts to de-escalate, right? And so really anything goes, contingency and solidarity at the same time.
Please. It strikes me that Renata is asking the most important question, which is, of course, how we take your material and then move forward, right? Do we want to, we realize the world loves binaries, and we realize that polarizations are easier to think with in lots of toxic ways. We want to get past them in many places, and so I don't want to slow her down, but I do want to work with the material of the presentation and stick to binaries for a second and ask about styles in a binary way. When I looked at these kind of cultural clashes in other settings, I always found a great deal of imitation. And that's always one of the things that holds me off a little bit when we hear about the kreativ or the monstration, right? With that, the term that you had very, you put up on the screen, you know, that this is not a classic demonstration, this is more of a creative demonstration.
Yeah.
And I only worry about that term among all of them. There are many terms to worry about, but that's really the one that I think is the most misleading, strangely, because it defies or underestimates the creativity of a more conservative approach, right? So are you finding this kind of limitation? Are you finding this kind of parody, or are they ultimately different styles? I mean, I know they don't look the same. You've got this, and you've got the, the people with the blue hair, and we get all of that, but they're both using memes, they're both using public presentations, they're both monstrations.
Right.
Is where do we want to see the differences in form? Or are they very similar? That's the thing I think about so much, is that every picture that you have.
Well, I guess I'm curious, why should there be differences in form?
No, they don't have. Yeah, sorry. The question is, are there differences in form? Because my guess is that they're imitating each other quite intensely.
Well, okay, so I have an article about demonstration coming out soon, I hope. But it's in an edited volume, so who knows? But they actually share a lot. So I was at meetings where nationalist activists were closely looking at why the liberals were successful at drawing attention, and can we do that? So this happens all around. People share strategies and tactics through the media, right? And they try to be innovative. So these communists, I remember I went to this picket that no one came, but a journalist came, so that was fine. They're doing of chanson songs in the middle of wintry Novosibirsk. So I don't think it really, the stylistic differences in terms of getting attention are very similar, and I think that's fine. I think the things, just sometimes you can't use form. You can't read form imminently for progressive or regressive content, right? So that's my point, is that you have to look at, again, how an event actually helps make or break connections. How does it circulate? What is its afterlife? So for example, the demonstration is a great example. There's this article, I think recently in the Slavic Review, about, for example, things like the Immortal Regiment, right? Where, can we just look at it, at the form? Can we look at the slogans? Can we look at the pictures and say if it's helping the regime or if it's helping opposition? We can't. It's not imminent, this meaning of it, right? We can't look at form closely. We have to, being as a linguistic anthropologist, we have to look at how it circulates. What is its uptake, right? How do people interpret this event after the fact, in conversations on the media, in kitchens, right? In activist groups. So it's in the same way that these protests and counter-protest discussions only have meaning once people start talking about them and they circulate, and that's how their meaning is determined. But there's definitely a lot of activists in Novosibirsk who don't participate in this kind of public political theater, right? Who are just going to villages and or going to checking store shelves for for expired products, right? There's a lot of consumer activism, or they're like going to villages and trying to like get roads repaired. And so there's definitely a huge contingent, maybe Sasha, you studied some of them when you were in Novosibirsk, of people who just are doing a different kind of, they're diagramming their work in different ways. Subotniki is a great form. That's not like demonstration. You know what the Subotnik is? It's the work group, the Soviet work group. That's also loved by both liberals and nationalists and conservatives, because it's really kind of, it can bring people together and shared labor side by side, and it diagrams this kind of side by side as opposed to oppositional force. And then it's widely used by all kinds of political people. So
well, I'll stop there, but I think the reason I asked the question is just that if indeed there is a relative parity in form, then that kind of resonates, that ricochets back so much to your lead case about publics and the plural, right? It's a different, if it's such a shared publicity, it's such a shared public performance, that adds a wonderful layer to the wonderful work you're already doing.
Right. Well, I think that's the whole point of it. It's like the imaginary of a polarized, the polarized imaginary. It doesn't necessarily map on to the practice of the way discourse actually circulates. So it has force, it has effects, the polarization imaginary, but doesn't actually, right? It's an imaginary. There's also lots of practices that might be counter to it, or that actually prove that lots of other things are going on, and that can be mobilized, perhaps. So
we have a question on the screen.
Yes.
We'll take this.
Thanks. This was a really interesting talk. I'm curious. So it seems to me like this rhetoric about polarization is specific to a kind of society that sees itself as being liberal, or at least a society in which sees itself as kind of like this diverse set of groups that have different interests and are seeking ways to manifest those interests in a public space. It seems to me that in the last month, that society in Russia has disappeared. Or at least on the level of official rhetoric. So now there is sort of there is an official line, and then there are like dissidents now, people who are formerly liberals or who are otherwise detached from the official line on the war. So what do you see as the future of this kind of rhetoric going forward after February 24th?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. Once you stop, at least, right, pretending, or stop to use the sort of liberal theatrics of reciprocity and egalitarian kind of, right, symmetry in public life. Once you stop like subscribing to it, what happens? It'll be interesting to see. And I guess, right, and this is the same way, right, the Soviet Union was, the constitution was like the most like liberal, progressive constitution, like liberal in that sense, right, the most progressive constitution, so the dissidents could just point to the constitution and say, we're for these things, like, and so we have to pay lip service to this sort of paradigm of everyone getting to talk and being free and being able to self-organize and self-determine in opposition to a state. What happens now is, it's going to be interesting, I guess. Right now, there is no talk allowed that's not, in some ways, pro-regime, and so there's no way to have these conversations in public. That's a huge problem. I think, as I was saying, public life was important in Russia, even though it was kind of pushed out and slowly squeezed out of the public sphere, especially with COVID measures, all protests becoming illegal. I think we'll see. I have no idea. I mean, because of this sort of erasure of all public activity that doesn't have to do with this kind of polarized stance taking against the war, it's just really a disaster for this public culture. I don't know. I think it'll be preserved in a kind of tacit underground form. But I don't think that this main kind of imaginary of dialogue and reciprocity is not only liberal, right? This is why, right, the sort of, for example, Bakhtin was a kind of anti-liberal thinker, and Voloshinov, right? These early philosophers of language and speech in Soviet Russia, they had a different kind of imaginary that was not liberal, but that also allowed kind of for this effect of reciprocity to really matter politically. So I think this imaginary of dialogue and conversation is bigger than the liberal framework, and I think it can continue to force people to act in certain ways, and it can be used for good, despite the sort of anti-liberal stance taken by the regime. They are claiming to be anti-fascist. So in some ways, they're still saying, right, we're anti-evil. So maybe that's the last hope. Maybe some anti-fascist activists in Russia can be like, we're for anti-Russian fascism and be allowed to speak or something. I don't know, that's my answer.
We're at our waking hour of 4:30. We have many kind people on the screen who are up behind us here at 19 University Place in New York. So we want to thank the audience over there who are up on the camera. We want to thank the very kind group here and our speaker for joining us, please.
And please email me. I mean, this last question is very important, and let's see what happens. So thank you all for your time.